Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome students, teachers. The Honourable Grant Robertson hopefully will be here shortly to this Wellington School of Business and Government webinar to discuss the 2021 budget. I'm Jane Bryson. I'm the Acting Pro-Vice-Chancellor and Dean of the Wellington School of Business and Government, and I'm a professor in the management group. Welcome. I can see that Grant Robertson is online with us now too. Thanks to you all for joining us online for this Budget 2021 discussion. We're sorry that the change in COVID alert levels has meant that we couldn't host you in Rutherford House, the home of the Wellington School of Business and Government, which is only 5 minutes walk from Parliament and government departments where all these budget decisions get made. We hope to see you here some other time. It's great that we had nearly 290 students and their teachers due to attend this in-person event today, but we had always intended to film the session as we did last year so that students all around the country can have an opportunity to hear from the Minister too. So welcome also if you are watching this as a recording, and thank you to those that are here online. As a capital city business school embedded in the heart of Wellington, we draw on the expertise of the businesses and government organisations around us to inform our teaching and research. You may have noticed in our name that we're not just a business school, we're a school of business and government. And that not only reflects our location, but also because business and government are two groups of people and activities that fundamentally influence and shape the society we live in. To study one group without considering the other is only to get part of the picture. So through our unique combination of business and government expertise, our students gain a valuable set of skills that prepares them, hopefully, for extraordinary careers in either business or government or both. And hosting events like this demonstrates the university's close connections and physical proximity to and our unique track record of engagement with government. A big thank you to Grant Robertson and his parliamentary colleagues for always being willing to have these discussions here at the university. To the students and teachers watching, we would love to have you here studying a Bachelor of Commerce or a diploma or a master's program with us. We've got great staff who are passionate about education and exploration in the rapidly changing world of business and government. I don't think it's ever changed as rapidly as it has in the last few years. Sustainability, ethics, entrepreneurship and innovation, well-being, these are some of the current themes that run through many of our disciplinary areas: economics, finance, accounting, commercial law, management, marketing, international business, tourism, public policy and information systems. So I'll just quickly run through some ways that students might consider connecting with the Wellington School of Business and Government before I formally introduce the Minister and we get into the heart of the budget discussion. So now is a sort of prime time for engagement with the university. There's a lot going on. Here are some key dates. There are information evenings that have been running since May and will continue to run. And we also have scholarships that have opened in mid-June, and the deadline for applying for those is at the beginning of September. August, you can start applying for residential halls. And the big event really is the 20th of August, which is the University Open Day. But of course, we're keen and interested to engage with you at any time. Just move to the next slide, which shows our school leaver scholarships. We have many of these to award to talented school leavers of different values and just go online to our scholarship site to have a look at those in more detail. Oops, I think we've missed a slide here. Just go back one. Also, if your high school is wanting to visit Wellington and visit us here at the Wellington School of Business and Government when we're not at Alert Level 2, then you're most welcome to. We've got a description here of the sorts of things that we do when you come to us for the day. Taste a lecture, someone from business to speak to you, and also an overview of what it would be like to be a student here. So schools can get in touch with Rachel Thacker or Jackie Harper, the people that have been in touch with you already, if you're wanting to come and visit us. We'd love to see you. Just move to the next slide. So there are various ways to connect with us. Please come and look at our website, look at us on LinkedIn, we're on Twitter, we're also on Facebook. So link with us through any of those mechanisms, and we'd love to keep in touch with you. So I mentioned before that business and government are two groups of people and activities that fundamentally influence and shape the society we live in. And to study one group without considering the other is to only get part of the picture. And that's the challenge that the government has in its budget task every year. Balancing that complex mix of interdependencies that enable our society to function and thrive, to achieve well-being individually and collectively. The budget this year is a prime example, balancing issues of COVID, employment, unemployment, housing, health, education, climate change, productivity. I'm sure we will all have lots of questions about that balancing act. So it's really my pleasure to welcome and introduce the Honourable Grant Robertson, Deputy Prime Minister, MP for Wellington Central, my MP, Minister of Finance, Minister for Infrastructure, Minister for Racing, and importantly, Minister of Sport and Recreation. So he is responsible for the Black Caps' win as the World Test Cricket Champions. Grant has a presentation that he will talk through for about 30 minutes. I will move through the slides for him, assuming my cursor works correctly. And then he'll answer questions. For those of you that are participating in this event live in the webinar, you can type your questions in online in the question and answer section. And you can vote for questions, I believe. So if you see a question that you really want to see answered, you can vote for it. There's no pressure, Grant. And it's my job at the end, once Grant's talked through his slides, to make sure that he picks up the questions. And there are also a few questions that we received in advance from a couple of schools, which I will put into the mix as well. So hopefully all our technology works smoothly. And Grant, I will click through to your slides.
Thank you, Jane. Kia ora, ngā mihi nui kia koutou katoa. Greetings, everybody. It's great to be with you. I am sorry that we're not in a position to be able to have today's session all together, but it is a reminder to all of us that we are still very much living with COVID-19, both here in New Zealand and around the world. And that was, as Jane's already alluded to, one of the issues that we were dealing with putting the budget together, was that despite the fact that in New Zealand we've had an extended period with limited restrictions or no restrictions on our movement and our social and economic activity, many other countries in the world still face those restrictions and indeed are now facing third and fourth waves of the virus. And so that shadow of COVID-19 was very much cast over the budget and was one of the main things we had to bear in mind. In putting the budget together this year, our focus was on the title of the budget, which you'll see on the screen, which is Securing Our Recovery. This is very much the idea that New Zealand's response to COVID-19 has been very positive and very good, and it has put us in a strong position to be able to recover. But there are certain things we needed to do to make sure that we did secure that. We also have to continue to look to the long term in our budgeting process. Obviously, what gets focused on in most budgets is the spending, the new spending that will be done over the coming year or 2 or 3 years beyond that. But equally, we have to keep an eye on the long-term fiscal situation for New Zealand. So that includes our levels of debt, whether or not we're able to run an operating surplus, and other indicators such as unemployment and so on. And so those balance of providing for the here and now and the needs that we have, and a long-term fiscal situation that leaves future generations as at least as well off, if not better off, than we have been, is very important to us. If we go to the next slide, Jane, and this is the test of your cursor, is to see if it works. I can see your cursor, so that's something encouraging. There we are. So as many of you will know, since 2019, we've been putting our budgets together using a wellbeing approach. And this is essentially based on a piece of work done by the New Zealand Treasury called the Living Standards Framework. And what that does is look at our society and our economy, not just through the lens of our financial position, which we do, but in addition to that, how we're doing it looking after our people, our environment, and our communities. And the framework that the Treasury has designed uses the language of economists to describe that, which is to talk about the 4 capitals. So those are financial, human, natural, and social, or as I say, essentially the money, the people, the environment, and our communities. And we use that framework to decide not only what to invest in, but also to measure our success. And part of our budget documentation is something called the Wellbeing Outlook. It's quite a long document, and on the slide there, you'll just see some small highlights from it. If I can just briefly characterize them, that is that New Zealand's well-being held up pretty well through COVID, and in fact was actually slightly higher as we moved through COVID, as people, I think, felt supported both by measures that the government took, but also by one another. And one of the things I think was very instrumental in New Zealand doing well, and perhaps better than some other countries, were our stocks of social capital. That is the trust that we have in each other and the trust we have in our institutions, including in government. However, as you'll see from the slide there, the well-being of New Zealanders is experienced unevenly, and particularly those who are sole parents, unemployed, if you're Māori or Pacifica in terms of your health or education or other social outcomes, that is not as good as the rest of the population. And so that knowledge about the unevenness of well-being in New Zealand influences what we then invest in, and you'll certainly see in a few moments when I go through the main areas of investment in the budget, how our understanding of New Zealand's well-being impacts how we put our budgets together. If we go to the next slide and then the one after it as well. Thanks, Jane. So that's a brief slide there on the GDP, and we can go to the unemployment one that's next. Just to show that we are better off than we thought. So what you see there on the unemployment chart is where we were projected to be in terms of unemployment at this time, and that was at around just under 10%. The good news is we've peaked up just over 5% and now come down to about 4.7%. That is a very good result relative to the rest of the world. It's an extremely good result, with the OECD average for unemployment being up over 6%. We think that a significant part of this was the wage subsidy scheme, which meant that people stayed in work. Precipitous decisions weren't made about laying people off, and that cash flow and confidence that went with the wage subsidy scheme then in turn allowed people to recover better. At the same time, New Zealand's exports have continued to do very well, and so the New Zealand economy is actually now operating at a level about where it was before COVID in terms of activity. That's a pretty remarkable result given the hit that the New Zealand economy experienced. If we just go on pass the intro slide to the first chart. So what you'll see there is for GDP, which is the traditional measure we use for economic activity, you'll see what's essentially a pretty standard V-shaped recovery, an enormous shock to the New Zealand economy through 2020 and COVID, and then a big bounce back. What you'll also see at the end of that chart is some pretty significant volatility. And I think that's one of my overarching messages, is that there isn't an economic forecast document that I get that doesn't have some words like uncertainty or volatility in it. The rest of the world's dealing with COVID still. We're not all fully aware of the full economic impact, let alone the health impact. And so you're going to see charts with quite a bit of that kind of movement in them as we get a bit more certainty. But the good news there is that we're forecasting GDP growth to average out at about 3.5% over the forecast period. That is a very solid and sound result for that particular measure. We go to the next slide, please, Jane. As I said, unemployment, the reason that there's a spider appeared on the chart there is that Treasury actually finalised its unemployment forecast before we got the latest data. And so we're already ahead of where the Treasury thought we would be at that time, this time. And you can see the trend back down towards 4% for unemployment. Again, a very good result given the circumstances. Next slide, thanks, Jane. So this is the slide that measures what's called the Obergall, which is what's commonly, when people talk about this in the media, talks about our deficit or our surplus. So this is the year to year where we're at in terms of our spending. You'll see that obviously the deficit caused by the very large amount of debt we had to take on and the amount of money we've needed to spend does begin to reduce significantly. And by the end of our 4-year period, we're just about getting back into surplus. And if we were to extend this chart out to 26, 27 in our projection period, you would see that we'd be back in surplus. We're not going to try to get our books back into surplus ahead of where the economy and society is. So if we were to try to take measures to get back to surplus within 1 or 2 years, that would require us to significantly reduce the spending and the investment that we need to be making to support strong public services and to help people get through COVID. The kind of approach that would take you back there much quicker is often referred to as austerity measures, and the government simply isn't prepared to do that. We don't think that would be the right thing for the long-term benefit of society or the economy. So we have a gradual return to surplus around about on the same time scale as the previous government did when the global financial crisis hit. Next slide, thanks, Jane. There's quite a lot in this slide, but this is a slide that depicts where our net debt track is. Similar point to the one I've just made, that we are heading back. We peak up in debt in around the 2023 year, and then we begin to come off. This is the debt we've taken on in order to get us all through COVID. I 100% stand by the decision that we needed to make to borrow this money. We do need to begin to return our levels of debt back to lower levels than we are at the moment. But again, that will be a gradual exercise in order to protect our social services and protect the supports that we've put in place. Next slide, thanks, Jane. Now, it's not a competition. But if you were to compare us to Australia, who brought their budget out just a little bit before ours, you'll see on the indicator there on GDP, on employment and on unemployment, that New Zealand is going ahead of where Australia is. And if we go to the next slide, Jane, also on debt and on our operating balance, Australia measures net debt differently to New Zealand, but if we use their measure, we end up at a significantly lower level than they are at. So as I say, not a competition, but just a slide to illustrate that we are doing pretty well relative to those countries we often choose to compare ourselves to. Next slide, thanks. All of this means that we've been able to do 2 things in this budget that I was not confident when I was beginning to put it together that we would be able to do. We're able to see those levels of debt and deficit come down, but we're also increasing our spending. And that's both in what we're doing in what's called operating spending, the day-to-day expenditure that we do, and capital spending, the buildings and the infrastructure and so on. So we've increased both of those at the same time as being able to bring debt down and bring the deficit down. And that's the balance I've been talking about. And it's a good tribute to the strength of the New Zealand economy that we've been able to do that. Next slide, thanks, Jane. So for this term of government, the government has the three priorities that you see there. The first of those is continuing to keep Aotearoa New Zealand safe from COVID-19. Clearly, the threat of COVID-19 is with us, and those of us in Wellington know that more than anyone else at the moment. And that, I will come back to that at the end of my presentation, but that remains an important element of our work. The budget, however, focuses on the second and third priorities, accelerating our recovery and rebuild, and getting on to addressing the big long-term foundational issues we have, climate change in particular, housing and child wellbeing. Go to the next slide and the next one. And so, as I say, that gives you an idea of the overall amount of spending, new spending that you're going to see over this forecast 4-year period. Just a little note there at the bottom bullet point that we have kept back $5.1 billion from our COVID response and recovery fund in order to make sure, should there be a significant resurgence and we had to pay out something like the wage subsidy or what's called our new resurgence support payment, that we have money put aside to do that. Next slide, thanks, Jane. So you would have heard probably, and it's been a little while since the budget now, you would have heard quite a bit about the first of the priorities, highlights rather, on that table there. The lifting of benefits was a really significant and important part of this budget. We made the decision that, having established something called the Welfare Expert Advisory Group, that it was very clear in the advice that they gave us that the value of main benefits had slipped significantly below levels that we would be comfortable for people being able to live their lives with a sense of dignity. And so that's why we have increased benefits by what are very large amounts, per week amounts that you see on the slide there. Given that there's been so much focus and attention on that in the period after the budget, I'm not going to talk so much about it today, other than to make a point that in addition to supporting those who are on very low incomes, this also has the effect of continuing to stimulate the economy, because around about $3 billion extra is now going to be in the economy with these benefit rates increasing, and that money gets spent in the communities in which those people live. And so that acts to support small businesses and others to be able to operate in this COVID era. We go on to the next slide and I'll work through those core issues. So housing remains one of our biggest issues. The government made a number of announcements in March around our attempt to try and really get on top of the housing crisis, and those have been funded in the budget. I just note that there's a mixture here of funding to help others build houses and funding for the government itself to build houses. This has to be a long-term series of commitments, and there's a particular focus on Māori housing because we know that home ownership rates for Māori are significantly lower than the rest of the population, and this starts to come back to some of that wellbeing work that I mentioned earlier. Next slide, thanks, Jane. Clearly, climate change and dealing with the government's role in supporting our transition to a low-carbon economy is critical, and this will now be a feature of budgets from here onwards. The first point's one that only really those who are very focused on the way the government does its accounting perhaps would see the significance of, but we have made a commitment that the money that we get from the emissions trading scheme, which is the scheme to trade carbon credits that was set up many years ago now, that revenue will now all get recycled into programs that reduce our carbon and other emissions. It is really important we give certainty and a decent funding pathway to be able to support what is a big shift for the New Zealand economy. And then below there, you'll see a number of initiatives, one of which since the slide was created has now been announced, and that is the Clean Car Discount, the incentive program to get more low emissions vehicles on the road. We simply will not meet our climate change objectives unless we take significant action in the next 2 to 3 years around how we reduce our emissions across sectors ranging from agriculture through to transport, through to the way that we heat our different industrial plants, through to the energy efficiency of our homes. All of those are dealt with in the initiatives there, but there will have to be more and significantly more investment in this area over the next couple of budgets. And then the third, if we go to the next slide, so the third issue is the child wellbeing one, which I dealt with before. In terms of the other part of the priorities around accelerating our recovery, the big focus here is a boost to our productivity. And the way we've taken one major step towards that is our investment in infrastructure. And so the chart there shows you the investments that we're going to be making. We are significantly interested in how we can lift our performance, not only in transport, but also housing, the educational facilities, health facilities. And really what we're doing here is laying out a pipeline of funding that the government's providing to give certainty to the people who actually do the building. We need infrastructure to be developed more to improve our productivity so our cities are less congested, that we've got high quality facilities for us to provide our public services in. And so this is a very significant boost to that investment. Next slide, thanks. A number of other areas we're doing that, particularly in the area of rail. Rail is a great investment because not only does it reduce emissions by getting trucks off the road, but also supports job creation and particularly good in areas like apprenticeships. And so a big boost to our rail there. And then continuing to support those sectors who have been affected by COVID, particularly tourism, but also our small businesses, and listening to small businesses that really what they want is support to get online and be trading online. Next slide, thanks. Some continuing boosts into training and skills, which are a really important part of productivity, and in particular a real focus around what we call vocational education. So this is the trade training work that we've done. We've made apprenticeships and trade training free, and we're seeing a lot more people going into that, but we need to continue to boost that and support those who are currently out of work and being able to get further qualifications. At the same time, we're doing some big work to reform particularly the Resource Management Act and the way we manage water within our cities and towns in New Zealand. All of that's about improving our productivity, lifting the value of what we do, and creating more high-paying jobs. Next slide, thanks, Jane. As in every budget, health is a big part of the investments we make, and we are completely reforming our health system. We're getting rid of the DHBs. There's investment in this budget to do that. But at the same time, while we're in that process of reform, we've got to continue to make sure that health services are offered, and that's the funding that you see on the chart there, as well as a real focus around Pharmac, where clearly, there are calls for even more investment than what we have made, but you'll see that we feel we've boosted that budget significantly over recent years. And then a range of other health initiatives, including the ones that were announced just before the budget around improvements for cancer screening. Next slide, thanks. Continuing to invest in education. In the last term in government, Chris Hipkins, the Minister of Education, set off a number of reform processes, including around NCEA, which I'm sure many of the students would be interested in the change program there, and we have listened to students' voices in that process, as well as a big investment in Māori and Pacific education, and making sure that we particularly are able to expand opportunities for Pacific language learning, but also to Reo Māori as well. Next slide, thanks. As I said, I wanted just to come back to keeping New Zealanders safe from COVID-19. The vaccine rollout is one of the most important things that we can do. And we've put aside more than $1.5 billion actually now to make sure that the vaccine program rolls out well. We are very confident that we have enough doses available for all New Zealanders who want to get the 2 doses free of charge to get them by the end of the year. And the reason for that is because we have a delivery schedule with Pfizer, who are the provider of that vaccine. So everyone will get one. You'll see some stories at the moment where people are concerned about whether they can get their booking right now, but everybody will be able to get access. And since the budget and since these slides were created, that includes 12 to 16-year-olds. And that's a really important step forward. The clinical trials have now been done in the US and elsewhere, and we're aware that that opportunity is an important one for lifting the immunity of New Zealanders. So the work program on how that will happen is happening now, but your schools and also when your other family members are getting vaccinated, we're now going to be in a position for 12 to 16-year-olds to get that too. So a little bit of paperwork to be done before that rolls out fully. So you'll hear a bit more about that over the coming weeks. And we continue, obviously, with our managed isolation, quarantine, and border work. It is so important that New Zealanders do get vaccinated. It's not compulsory, but we really need all New Zealanders who can and are willing to do so to step forward, because that's what will allow us to begin to open up our borders a bit more and see life look a little bit more like it did before COVID came along. But we won't get there without a vaccination program, and we need everybody's help in that. And just, I think the last couple of slides now, Jane, the next one is an interesting idea that's emerged as a lesson from COVID. We found that one of the things we had to do, just as the previous government had to do after the Canterbury earthquakes, was provide some emergency support for people who lost their jobs very suddenly. They lost their jobs suddenly. They still had outgoings that were commensurate with what income they previously had. And to avoid the economic scarring, the potential of people having to sell houses and uproot their families and so on, we're proposing a scheme that runs in a lot of other countries, which is a social insurance scheme that would support people at 80% of their income with some caps. My computer has died.
Okay, everyone, just a slight interruption while Grant's computer is being re-established. Are you able to see us, Grant?
You think you can hear me, I suspect?
Yes, we can hear you and we can see you.
Yeah, good-o. I can't see you, so just give me a moment. Right, interesting. That was a technological moment for us all there. All right, so as I said, yeah, that scheme is common in a lot of other countries in the world, and we're looking to develop that in consultation with Business New Zealand and the Council of Trade Unions over the next little while. And the final slide, if we go there, Jane. So in summary, this really is a budget set in the shadow of COVID. We are trying to develop a series of initiatives that get on top of the big issues of our time around housing, around child poverty and climate change. But we want to do that in a balanced way that creates jobs, keeps our fiscal position strong in the hopefully unlikely event of further disruptions to the economy such as COVID. And so for us, it's a budget which had that balance in mind, and obviously it's up to the people of New Zealand as to whether they feel we got that balance right. So Jane, I'll leave it there, and I'm very happy to answer whatever questions you have.
Great, thank you very much, Grant. That was a great overview of the budget, which obviously took a lot more time to prepare than it did to present. And so people that are here online with us live, if you want to type in any questions, please go ahead and do that. In the interim, I have some questions that were already sent in by a couple of schools, so I'll just pose some of those to you, Grant, on their behalf. So first, we had a question from Wellington Girls College from Jessica. How much do you think the spending commitment we had to make on COVID will change the government's fiscal planning in New Zealand now and in years to come?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Jessica, and I covered some of that in the presentation. Clearly, when you're needing to take on extra debt to the extent that we did, it's going to have a big impact. We measure that debt in a couple of different ways. The main way we measure it is as a percentage of the economy overall, as a percentage of GDP. And on that score, we've gone from about 19%, and we're projected to peak up in the mid 40% area. So that's a massive increase. In dollar terms, that's going to turn out to be a good $100 million extra than what we had, $100 billion, dollars extra than what we had intended to borrow. And so that has to have a big impact. As I said before, the way we're looking at it is we will reduce that debt over time, because we want to bring ourselves back to a position that were we needing at some point in the future to increase debt, that we had the room to do that. The Treasury tell us that in a crisis, the New Zealand economy can sustain something between 50 and 60% net debt, and then come back down from there. So we haven't got as high as that, which is a good thing, but we do want to see it consolidate down. As I said before, there are some people who are advocating for us to move much more quickly back to that position with those lower levels of debt. But our view is, in order to do that, we would have to stop a lot of very important programs that we've got, and we're just not prepared to do that. I guess the other really important thing is that when we compare ourselves to the rest of the world, we're in a much stronger position on debt. So my British equivalent, the person who does my job in the United Kingdom, produced a budget a month or two before mine, and he had 100% net debt in his budget. So other countries who went into this crisis in a more difficult position than we did are really struggling with their repayment. So debt is a really important position for people to be able to think about, but it's got to be balanced.
Okay, Grant, we've got a couple of
questions
that have appeared online.
Yep.
You can see those. Yep.
Yep. So I can work my way through those and come back to your other one if you like.
Sure.
So in terms of the question is why have we not implemented the full benefit recommendations of the Welfare Advisory Group? We've certainly taken on board the major ones that we have seen. The first of those, the largest of those, was the increases to main benefit rates that we've indicated. In addition to that, we had already done some of the other recommendations, such as indexing benefits to the average wage, and that will make a big increase as we move forward, that rather than benefits having to be increased by a specific decision, we can simply do that in line. We've made changes around what's called the abatement rate, which allows people to keep more of their income before their benefit reduces, keep more of income they earn from working before their benefit begins to reduce, which is a really important way of supporting people back into some other types of work. Reinstated the training incentive allowance, which is another recommendation, which is about giving support to people on benefit to undertake degree level qualifications. There are still one or two changes that we haven't yet looked at, and we're working our way through those. But our view is that we're taking the most significant steps we can at the moment, and the Welfare Expert Advisory Group their report remains the blueprint for us, that we will continue to look at how we can go ahead with the other recommendations that have not yet been implemented. Jacob has a question saying, in comparison with 2021, but the last year's budget, he's asking, why has there been a $4 million increase in budget money allocated towards the provision, purchase and support of health and disability services that are provided by Māori for Māori, especially when reports have shown that Māori Pacific peoples recorded lower life satisfaction, health and access to education services. Jacob, I think what you've hit on here is really in essence the way we do some of the accounting in the budget. So where money is provided for a specific service or a specific purchase, and not all of that money is used in a particular year, sometimes the decision is made to return what's called returning that money to the centre. So basically the money was allocated, but it wasn't all spent or utilised in a year, and then the portion that wasn't used comes back. In actual fact, the budget significantly increases the amount of money available for health and disability services going forward, especially those by Māori for Māori. And in particular, what this year's budget does is that it puts in place the building blocks for the new Māori Health Authority. And that will provide a great deal of more impetus and support behind by Māori for Māori solutions in health. It will be able, and it's in fact funded in part in the budget, to commission its own health services. We know that Māori health outcomes are poorer than the rest of the population, and we're really excited about now having a vehicle by which to focus in to get those interventions right. But in a sense, that $4 million was really just moving from an annual allocation back into the central pool, but there is an increase in funding and programs to support Māori health outcomes. If I scroll, if I scroll down my list here, the question, how will the money allocated to Scott Base be used, and what issues is it directed towards? I'm really impressed that people are reading the detail of the budget, so that's fantastic. That's a rebuild of Scott Base. So Scott Base is New Zealand's home in Antarctica. It's been there for a long time, and it's in desperate need of a complete change. And so this will rebuild the base, not only to be a safe and secure place for those New Zealanders who are on Antarctica, but also to rebuild it as a a higher quality research facility. So there'll be laboratory space, there'll be space for other researchers to be able to use when they go down to Antarctica. Around about $300 million redevelopment. And the other benefit that it has is it'll be New Zealand firms that'll be doing the building. There's a particular firm based out of Christchurch that's got a bit of experience building down on the ice, because it's a bit different from doing building projects elsewhere. And so it'll create a large number of jobs over the next few years. Next question from Tawa College is, how am I going to limit the effects of the $3 billion in extra spending as an injection into the economy on inflation? So this is a really good question around where we are in terms of the stimulus that we want in our economy. Because when we looked at where we were about a year ago, nobody was at all concerned or worried about inflation. We were just worried about making sure that the economy kept operating and jobs kept being created. At the moment, the economy is at capacity in some areas. So, for example, you might have read in the news people's comments about the supply of staff, of labour, because with the borders shut, you know, and as the economy grows faster than we expected, we haven't necessarily got all the people here we would normally have to do that work. So there are labour shortages. We've also got some real constraints around building supplies and so on coming into New Zealand because shipping routes have been disrupted by COVID and other issues. One of the reasons we think the support into benefits is good because that's a consumption-led stimulus. So it means that it's money that's being spent in small businesses who could really do with it. Overall, in terms of the impact on inflation, $3 billion within the much wider $300 billion New Zealand economy is small. So in terms of its single effect on inflation, it will be limited. But inflation more generally is forecast by the Treasury to peak up somewhere around 2.5% before coming down again. Bank economists more recently are saying something more like 3% inflation might be likely. That's still historically low and sits around the band that the Reserve Bank are obliged to try and keep inflation at. That's between 1% and 3%. So we think that's manageable. Wages are also forecast to go up by about 3% across the forecast period too. So some level of inflation in the economy is to be expected. We've just had a period of time where we've had very, very low inflation, but we think this is at a manageable level. But in particular, in answer to the question, the $3 billion we think targets a part of the economy that could do with stimulus, and relatively speaking is a bit lower than, is a small component to what we do. Our regular questioner has a couple more. And so I mentioned in the next budgets, we will invest in climate change solutions. My question is, why not tackle this issue in this budget? Well, we are. It's just that there will be a great deal more focus on that in the next two budgets. So I had a slide earlier which had a number of the initiatives we are taking in this budget, including our Green Investment Fund, where we partner with the private sector on new technological investments to reduce emissions, the support that we're giving to our Healthy Homes program to insulate homes, making the public sector carbon neutral by 2025. So we've got big investments there too. But one of the reasons was we put the budget together before we got the final report of the Independent Climate Commission. And that report has given us a very clear steer on what are called our carbon budgets, so what we need to do to reduce emissions across different sectors. And so that's why the next two budgets will focus more on that now that we've got the final answers there. But as you saw, we're moving as quickly and swiftly as we can with things like the clean car discount, but it's much more a signal that the next two budgets will have even more investment. And then the last question I've got there in front of me is around what part of the budget will be allocated to hospitals and their need for more nurses and nurses being able to perform well. Yeah, look, as I mentioned, a massive increase in health spending in this budget, about $4.7 billion. On an annual basis, we're now spending 45% more in the health area annually than when we came in to government in late 2017. So we are really, really boosting spending there. In terms of specifically for nurses, we've got, I think it's about 3,000 more nursing places in place than when we came into government. Not all of those have been filled yet because of, again, some of the issues around the borders and immigration. As you'll know, we're in a negotiation at the moment with the nurses about their latest pay round, having done a pretty big boost in 2018. It's now time for another negotiation. Part of that negotiation is actually the conditions in which nurses work, and we're trying to create what we call safe staffing levels for nurses. Not all DHBs have met those yet, and that is pretty disappointing to all of us, and kind of indicates one of the many reasons why we want to reform the health system and get rid of the DHBs and move to a model where we can get more consistency around the country around, for example, the way in which we do support nurses. So we are in a pay negotiation, so you'll hear a bit about that, but that doesn't take away from the fact that we're very committed to investing in health and making sure that our nurses are well supported. Oh, happy to inject new questioners in. Do you want to do,
Yes.
do you want to do your one, Jane, and I'll come back?
Yes, I've got a couple here from St. Patrick's Silverstream, which I'm keen that we cover off, given they sent them in. So one from Will, who is a year 13 economics student at St. Patrick's Silverstream, and he's got two questions. One is, they're both related to housing. Do you intend to balance the inflation gains of homeowners against the interests of young people who are being shut out of the housing market?
Yeah, look, we made a number of announcements in March around what we were trying to do on housing. Our focus is not so much on those who are owner-occupiers of housing, but those who use housing as an investment. And so our focus there is, as you might have heard, is to remove the ability of people to be able to deduct their interest costs on the borrowing they do for an investment property. So not the home that they live in, but the homes that they might rent out. And effectively, people have been running this in many ways as a business, and we think that that's led to speculation because there's been a tax advantage there. So we're removing that tax advantage. We do, however, want to see more homes built because we have an enormous shortage at the moment. And so we are retaining that tax advantage if you're building a new property, so that we're adding to the housing stock. We think that will make a difference in terms of tilting the market towards first home buyers. And also in the budget, we've increased the support we give to first home buyers who are gathering a deposit together, and how we can help more people into their first home. So that's the focus we chose, rather than looking specifically at all homeowners and owner-occupier owners. I recognise it's harder and harder for younger people, particularly, to get into housing. Unfortunately, we didn't build houses at the rate we needed to over the last couple of decades. We are playing catch up there, but we are, as a government, building more houses than any government since the 1970s. And the funds and support programs we put in, which I mentioned earlier, will see more houses built by the private sector too. But house building does take time, and so it'll take us a while to get back to all of that.
A related question from Will was that student allowances and benefits are being increased as per the budget. However, is this an effective economic policy in the face of saturated and very responsive housing market? Will this not simply increase the price level of housing?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know about the prices of houses, but there has been concern expressed that it would be passed on immediately by landlords in terms of increased rents, which is, I think, what Will is getting at with that question. The evidence when previously we've increased things like allowances and benefits is actually it doesn't increase rents by any more than rents would normally be increasing anyway. And we're just waiting to see where the data comes through in the next few months. But I think it was just yesterday we saw TradeMe's rental data come out that showed that there hadn't actually been a spike in rents as a result of some of the policies that we announced, that they'd basically flatlined where they have been in the last few months. So the evidence doesn't back up that. I know it's a kind of an assertion that people make, is that it'll automatically go into rents going up. So we keep an eye on that. There are a variety of things that can be done about that. If rents are increased beyond the market rate, it's possible for the Tenancy Tribunal to intervene at that point to make sure they're not. And we've also changed the law so you can only increase a rent once a year in a property that is rented out, to try and control some of the changes that people make there.
Okay, I think the other question from St. Pat's you've answered, because it was really about, do you think the 3.8 billion being put into Housing Acceleration Fund could become the solution to the ongoing housing crisis, and if so, how?
It'll certainly help, but there is no silver bullet when it comes to housing. But the biggest issue raised with us by local government and by private sector developers is access to what they call build-ready land. So that's land that's got the pipes and the drains and the roads associated with it, so that they can get on with building the houses. And quite small amounts of money put in by the government can unleash a large number of houses being built. And so we do think that fund will be really, really important. If I go back to the list, Jacob's got another question around whether we're ready to respond to another resurgence. Look, as I said in the presentation, Jacob, yes, I believe we are. We've kept money aside should we need it for a resurgence. We're obviously hopeful that our vaccination program will see a reduction in the likelihood of resurgences. As you know, New Zealand took a different approach than other countries and focused on vaccinating our border workforce and our health workforce first, because that's where the greatest risk of infection actually lay for us. Other countries were dealing with community infections in there when they were doing vaccination, and so they focused in a different way. But we've put resources aside if it's needed to be able to deal with that. And then Tawa College is back asking if in the budget I've taken a cost-benefit analysis of opening the travel bubble with Australia with the economic effects from a lockdown or high alert levels, and does the benefit of increased productivity from workers matter? I think it's a really interesting question. I mean, in terms of cost-benefit analysis, I mean, quite clearly, it's actually quite a complex analysis, because cost-benefit, you really have to put risk as the main thing that you're looking at here. So the strong advice we had from our health officials was that given the way that Australia had managed the pandemic, which was very similar to the way that New Zealand had managed the pandemic, that we could manage the risk of there being outbreaks. We've now had our first example of that in Wellington at the moment. The Treasury model would tell you that if Wellington was at alert level 2 for 7 days or so, that would cost about $10 million to the Wellington economy. We know that the number of visitors who've come into New Zealand and the benefit that we've got from that from Australia has well and truly exceeded that already. So that is within the calculations, but we primarily made our calculation on the basis of public health and the fact that we felt this was manageable, and so far it has been. But obviously, if we saw very, very significant outbreaks, that would cause us to rethink all of our settings. We're not expecting that. We have good relationships with Australia, and we are able to manage that.
Great. I think that's all the questions, and we're just about up to time as well. So I would just like to, first of all, thank the Honourable Grant Robertson very much for giving up your time today, Grant. We've probably eaten your entire lunch hour for you, assuming you have one as a busy parliamentarian. These discussions are really valuable, and there'll be a lot of secondary schools watching this not live, recorded when we send it out. So thank you to the people that were here live, and for the questions and the questions that were sent in advance. It's been great, and we hope to be able to welcome schools back to the Wellington School of Business and Government once our alert levels go down the scale again. And we hope to see you in person too, Grant.
Thanks, Jane. Thanks very much.